So I think we're going to begin with a second portion of the afternoon with our panel of artists. And again, I hope you're all enjoying the symposium. I'm just going to begin with brief introductions of the three artists, and then they will each come up and speak for about a half hour, and then we'll have a conversation afterwards moderated by Julia Bryn-Wilson. So, the introductions. For those familiar with Southern California, George Herms, our first speaker, needs no introduction. Many of us have experienced firsthand the warmth, generosity, and just sheer fun of his spirit and keen intellect. But you may be interested to learn that Herms, before becoming one of the founding figures of West Coast assemblage art, was the son of an agronomist and got his start at Berkeley as an engineering student. Encounters with jazz and literature righted that situation, and by the mid-1950s, Herms was well on his way to becoming the artist that he is today. In the decades since, in addition to producing his own work, he has been a tireless champion of the legacy of Wallace Berman, Robert Alexander, and his many close friends in the assemblage scene. In addition to retrospectives of his work at the Newport Harbor Art Museum and the LA Municipal Art Gallery, in 2005, Walter Hopps curated an exhibition of his work at the Santa Monica Museum of Art. This past summer, MoCA Pacific Design Center's show, Xenophilia, Love of the Unknown, put Herms in artistic dialogue with a younger generation interested in working with found objects. And they include Catherine Andrews, Dan Colin, Elliot Hundley, Nate Lohman, Jack Pearson, Amanda Ross-Ho, and Kari Upson. So kind of a veritable kind of parade of young artists. In 1984, George was awarded the Prix de Rome, and in 2005, he was in residence at the Getty Research Institute, and it is the GRI's distinct honor to be home to his archive. Our second speaker is Suzanne Lacy. Suzanne Lacy's work includes installations, video, and large-scale performances on social themes. Her recent work includes the tattooed skeleton for the Museo Nacional Centro Reina Sofia in Madrid, the performance of prostitution notes at the Serpentine Marathon, and Young Women's Agenda in Anyang, Korea, with photographer Raul Vega, the University of Local Knowledge with the Arnolfini Gallery and the Knoll West Community Center, and an installation in the Medellin Biennial, Recuperating the Skin of Memory with Pilar Riano. Her work has been funded through numerous foundations, including the National Endowment for the Arts and the Guggenheim, Rockefeller Surdna, Nathan Cummings, Durfee, and California Community Foundations. Also known for her writing, Lacy edited the influential Mapping the Terrain, New Genre Public Art, published in 1995 by Bay Press, and has recently released Leaving Art, Writings on Performance, Politics, and Publics, 1974-2007 by Duke University Press. Suzanne Lacy's Spaces Between is a monograph by Sharon Irish, published by University of Minnesota Press. Lacy is also the chair of the Graduate Public Practice Program at Otis College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. And then last but not least, our third speaker, Mario Garcia Torres, was born in 1975 in Monclovan, Mexico. He received his BFA from the Universidad de Monterrey, San Pedro Garcia, Mexico, and his MFA from California Institute of the Arts. He now resides principally in Mexico City, though still makes it back to LA now and then. The list of international venues in which his work has been featured reads like an around-the-world tour. Artist Space in New York, the Museo Tamayo in Mexico City, the Venice Biennale, the Frankfurter Kunstverein, the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, Tate Modern in London, Yokohama Triennale, and the Sao Paulo Biennale. He has had solo exhibitions at the Jus de Paume in Paris, the Kunsthalle Zurich, the Centro de Arte Reina Sofia Madrid, and the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam. In 2007, he was the recipient of the Cartier Award at the Frieze Art Fair. So now we can welcome George Herms.
Think of the American Archives of Art as your wastebasket, is what Paul Karlstrom said to me in 1980. I was trying to figure out how I got here. How did I end up right here today at this moment? So I responded to with this, I said 3 questions. First of all, I'm a collage artist. You don't get my papers because they're my raw materials. I make my collages out of. Until I'm gone, you don't get them. The second thing is, what about money? You buy Winslow Homer's letters. My kids, you know, this will be part of the estate. And I can't remember what the third question was, but he said, it'll come to me. And he said, oh, we've never been asked these questions before. So then time goes along. In 1979, my first retrospective, which we'll see the cover of, was called the Prometheus Archives. And Betty Turnbull, bless her heart, she passed away last year, would come every Wednesday to my studio in downtown LA. She called Wednesdays were now Herms days. And we figured there was like 25,000 works of art we had to get into a retrospective. That's in 1979. Then in 1992, Barnesdale, the Municipal Art Gallery, it's called The Secret Archives, which is the title of a piece of mine. So the archives have been spinning around me, and I was asked about these Tap City Circus events that I would have, which I saw Nancy Perloff out in the lobby, wrote a beautiful sidebar to Pacific Standard Time about the Tap City circuses. And the events were, first of all, if you're going to live by your wits, you have to know how to throw a raffle, which means you have 2 sets of numbers, and people get one. And then the other set of numbers is in a bag or a bucket, and someone picks it out, and they're the winner. And the one that was very popular is that if you had that winning number, you got to squirt the artist with a hose. So that was always a big winning one. So at the so these things went on finally into downtown LA from Topanga Canyon. And one of them, you know, the eviction notices just keep coming around, like the tides go in, the tides go out. You know, I get a studio, everything's rosy. I don't pay the rent, you're thrown out on the street. It's a good system. I had some landlords would take art at the end of the year. That was wonderful. So we, you know, to check out the filing bankruptcy or whatever, and you're going by in the carpet store. It's going out of business. And it says, everything must go. And so the next raffle type event, we put that diagonally across saying, everything must go. And I had not thrown anything away for 50 years. And someone alerted the Getty. They said, listen, it would be a crime if all of that was dispersed, you know, because it was all in one place. So we began, Charles Merriweather and I, talking about how to do this. It led to the final eviction notice. I was invited to be a visiting scholar at the Getty Research Institute and was put up for 6 months and had a wonderful time with the scholars here. And then Marcia Reed and I sat down, and I'd had a meditation about the archives, and in it I said, I'll just bring all the boxes, it'll be part of my opera, we'll put them on the stage, we'll having dancing shredders. And at that moment, I forget who else was in that meeting, but there was a shudder that went through. So that was the job, was how to go through. So these boxes, which I'm going to show you visuals of everything I'm talking about in a second, because not throwing anything away meant that I kept all the raw materials for my collages, something I found in the street, run over, looked beautiful to me, a stained piece of paper. And then there'd be a beautiful poem from Robert Duncan. Then there'd be a collage from Jess. So how to winnow, that was the job. So I spent about 5 years up here winnowing with Sarah Anderson, a wonderful setup, a table. The box would come in, the things would be put on the table in front of me. There was an overhead camera going down on it. There was another camera straight ahead with a mic on it, and I would just say what it was. So that was the process. So I'm going to go to the visuals now. In these archives, you have things like this, which is a Wallace Berman photograph of me in 1960 for an exhibition that he had in a little gallery that had no roof. It was next to the Corte Madera Creek. And he had some things, I don't know what they were like cross-hatching you could lay over a photograph. So that's the kinds of things that are in it. Then my show, about the same time, there's a Semina Gallery, then there's the Batman Gallery in San Francisco, and I had 77 works in it, and someone came off the street, Chester Kessler, and shot the entire show. And he sent me these little, very small little pictures of things. So like this piece right here from 1959, Prez is Dead, like Bird, is still around. I still have it, but a lot of things have fallen off of it. There's another picture of it, and then there are lists. My archives are full of all these lists with the titles of all the works that are in here. And one of the 77 works is The Poet, which went to the Museum of Modern Art. Bill Seitz came through this time and chose that for the Art of Assemblage in 1961. So it is part of the archives. Then these are the boxes. And this is the way they came to the Getty. I don't know how many hundreds of boxes there were, and we had to go through them. We did save something, a couple boxes, just wrapped them to show the source. Sorry, I'm going back. This right here, that's Mussolini's granddaughter. So all of a sudden, my feelings about fascism, that no, 3 generations go down, man, and all of a sudden there's this beautiful chick, and there's Michael McClure, right? So, but that's what we had to go through, box after box of that. And there are absolute jewels in it and a lot of information. Now, how this, the usage of these vis-a-vis what you were talking about, as a, to use them to make a statement or to draw up a narrative even. I mean, I don't know. I just keep plowing ahead. I get up every day and make art. And so, you have these boxes. This right up here is from a printing process, a photo process. Each thing had a story. I mean, this took me hours to go through. Now, how important that is, I mean, it was like being debriefed. Like I went off to this planet called George Herms and came back, and then I had to, describe it. So now we jump to 2011, and if you've seen the show, and I hope you all have, there's this beautiful room with incredible art in it, and Andrew Perchuk and Ronnie Singh came to me and wanted me to do something in the corner of this beautiful room full of great art. And the only thing I could think of was that old cliche, the straw that breaks the camel's back. That here you've got this beautiful room, and am I going to go in and fuck up? This was the thing. You know what I mean? But so the archives were the source of I'd say, the majority of these images, all of friends, and I'm not going to go through them all, but like I'm a minister, and I married Neil Young. So Neil Young is there. This is a garbage can with my daughter in it, and Artie Richards' wife, and my wife, and the Loda. So those are personal. Then you get up to like there's, somebody you don't know who they are because I just had them in my archives, right? Then there's David Meltzer, a poet, And then there's Bob Alexander, who was the Temple man that ordained me. And then there's my wife, Louise. And then there's Cameron. There's Tom Etherton, a beautiful piece of his just out in Pomona now. So these are things that come. And then there's one that says, "Oh, lovely gentle," and it's a picture of a horse's ass, which all of us in every family album has one of those, right? So, but it also has like objects and things. Excuse me, going back. Sometimes they're just objects, because that was one of the things I discussed. Could we have an archive of objects? Was that a possibility? And it was decided no, that would be too much to have an archive just of objects. So this is like a Semina, a Wallace Berman Semina. I took 5 years out of my life because none of us had a complete set of Semina magazines. And so Shirley did, and I didn't. So I did a facsimile edition. So the ones that you see traveling around the world in museums now, these are the ones that I did, where I actually had to write Wallace's, fake his number. This from Semina 8. The cover is by Dean Stockwell. And there's a beautiful collage of Jess's up there. And then we'll see a close-up of this one, which is maybe I don't know how this relates to archives, but Berman saw this photograph of the motorcycle. I found in an old house in Berkeley a bunch of old photographs, and there was this one person in all of the photographs, and I named him Paul Mystery, and did like a whole, the life of Paul Mystery. And then and all Wallace did was white out the face and use it to illustrate a Kirby Doyle poem. It's like a motorcycle poem. And then 1963, those are all things like in the early 60s. This is at Rolf Nelson's gallery, and my daughter Lilybell was born. I delivered the babies at home, and so it was a Joy Jump Temple of Light for Lilybell. And then I think John put details. This is the collage that I was doing in 1963. These black and white collages, which I'm now back making tons of collages out of fashion magazines, high, glossy things. Oh, I see, I don't have to look up here. They've got the picture right here. Okay, so, all right, and this then is like a 1960 collage, a cross made out of Hebrew characters with the original O before my kids swung with it. You can see that's the O that matches this typeface. And in all the others, you'll see it's become a stamp pad O off of a bottle of ink. And then this, I don't know what the hell this is, but it was in the archives. And this is one of the problems. You come across things, where does this fit? Work of art, we had works of art. But there you can see the original O. The O that's out of a bottle of ink. So then the Tap City Circus, this is the first raffle in Northern California. I was declared a public nuisance. And so then in, that was called New Sense on the Marsh. And so then in Topanga, this is 1965, my daughter Nalota is in the picture over there. And then these came around, I think Nancy Perloff was able to figure out they were like every 18 months. The next one was called Roofle. And everybody got, with their number on was a little poem. This was to fix the roof on the house. So, and there it is. And of course, there's many times that cut wood blocks, I forgot, that you have to do it backwards. So this is October 1966. Then here's Waffle, which was a wall full of, and now I'm going to publicly address Nancy. She said, was there anything, because I'm known as the minutiae kid around here. The wallful was not that everybody got a wallful, but on the wall were these beautiful balls of printer's ink. And so everybody got one of these printer's ink. You see the colors of the ink there. And then this is an earful. If the ear and the eye are one, that's what I put forward, and only one person argued with me about that. They're totally different, but in the heart, that's where I was coming from. And then this is a cover for a Diane de Prima book of poetry. She was the one that got me into this Love Press publishing thing. I went to New York to do sets for a Michael McClure play for Diane and the Poets Theater, and she and Roy, they were all in Amira Baraka. They were all in court with Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures, Roy's play, The Brig. So they were doing courtroom drama, and she gave me a set of haiku poems she had written. And I got wood blocks and began carving them for her. And this begins a long relationship with her that goes on today. And this is a Love Press book of my own work called 32 Palm Songs. It was going to be my 32nd year. I grew up in a house called on 32 Palm Avenue, and they were meant to sing in your hand. So they were meant to revolve. And the only one that I was hoping to be able to go point by point over everything you said today, and, the only one I could think of would be, whoops, wrong button. Up here, this one, the words go around, and you can read it, you can start in wherever you want. And there are some that had many, many lines. So, and there's another one where you drive around the poem. And maybe that's as close to, going into the archives and driving around in them, without having the little card that's not a round one. At the bottom says, once you get it together, forget where you put it. So that's the Love Press. And then what I did is I actually asked John, I said, just put together some things because how does what I brought here, how is it going to be used? How can it be fruitful and helpful to people? So John picked out some things, and this one is a Alexis Smith announcement, of which there's 3 of them because they're all addressed to the same address, but there's Ron Cooper and Doug Edge, George Herms, Margaret Nielsen. So this is now the convention center in downtown LA. But somehow I think what attracted John to this was that interweaving of artists that goes on. And also that what I do by taping things together is that the archives are continually being reworked. And this threw me for a loop, John, because I couldn't for the life of me figure out where, it's all my work, it's my studio, but what studio was that? You think you'd remember something like that, I'm able to identify it because, or the time, I can get the time down. This is that Prez is Dead like Bird, but what's right here, this one on the round surface, this is called the Mother's Group. And so when my son Wilder, when his mother was pregnant, she was an art historian. I met in Rome at the American Academy. She was one of, tell me when it's time for me to get off, Leo Steinberg's proteges. And he met with her in Rome to go over one of Guercino's paintings, because he had all these theories about Guercino, because Guercino's the first one they had drawings from, because all the Queen of England and the King of France, everybody was able to get his drawings. And they argued like crazy. Never settled it. He comes to LA, and I'm putting the baby to bed, and they're out in the kitchen. I come out, and I think, oh, I'm going to hear some real juicy art history gossip. Both of them were just bitching about their parents. So anyway, we still don't know where this is, but that's a typical studio. It'll come back to me. So this is in the Prometheus Archives in Newport Harbor, 1979. The piece, the sculpture is called The Secret Archives. And this is the one that I thought would be nice to have as a, begin an archive of objects, the objects in my life. That didn't happen, but and then this is the librarian. And it is an archive unto itself. And it was really a time, this is from 1960, where books were thrown away on a dump. And I would go out to this dump every morning and play a bamboo flute at dawn. And one day, and then gather things to make my sculptures that day. And this one day, all these books were thrown away. And in the little town where I was at, that was kind of the shape of the librarian that was there. You know what I mean? So she was the inspiration for this. The question was, this is Bill Seitz just coined that word, assemblage. And could assemblage be used to do portraits? And this was a stab at that. And the other, the meat market that's up at the De Young now, that was standing in front of the meat market in that little town. So could assemblage be used in more traditional ways? And this, I'll just finish up with my other hope when I got involved with this lovely institution up here was a witness protection program. I said, if you get me in a witness protection program, I'll tell you everything I know. And I said, and then I'll start making stuff up. And they never phoned me back. So anyway, thank you.
Let me know when we're 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about three things today, three sort of pieces of my practice. I particularly appreciated when Sven said that the archive is not a given, but it has to do with power and how that exists in sets of relationships. And I would say that's probably the way I think about archives. In one sense, of course, I'm interested in the practical, and I'm going to speak to that very briefly. How, as a performance artist, archiving becomes one of the major ways that you communicate your work over time and you enter the art discourse, and some of the problems that creates for us as practitioners today. But then I want to spend most of my time talking about two kinds of work. Now, I don't normally think about my work in terms of archiving as a substantive part of my practice. It is one thing I do, work with metaphors of archives. I'll be talking about how archiving itself, for me, has evolved into some artworks. And then briefly, I'll talk about some of the questions of restaging or recreation and how, in a sense, recreation is a revisiting of the archive of an original work. I started in the early 70s, and my influences are conceptual, political, and performative. And so as performance art developed, archiving became particularly relevant to those of us who started this practice. As it grew exponentially in California and generated changes in what we knew as art, it also generated a sort of a sense of difference in what we might collect if we were collectors, the materiality of and the necessity for archiving. Collecting where do I have to point this to make it work? There? Yeah, maybe I'll just do this. Oh, there. Okay. So collecting was, for most of us, and I know there are several performance artists from that era in the crowd today, and it was more or less intuitive. I think that There were some strains that you can isolate from that type of collecting. For some people, we didn't know. We just tended to collect because it sort of remembered the work for us. It allowed us to analyze it to some degree. For some, experience was so primary that documentation, as it was first known, was taboo. It was not something, because it would, the act of putting a camera between you and the work essentially distanced you. So, for example, Barbara Smith, in a meditative piece on the Great Squash that she did, allowed it to be photographed, but it was from a distance. She herself had no knowledge of when that photographer would arrive. For other people, like Alan Capro, they were interested in how the knowledge of the work was legitimately translated to others. And by legitimately, I mean under the terms that the work was executed then, how does the work enter the art discourse? And then for some people, I mean, I think one of the interesting issues for me that came up at that time was how the collection of work and the repository of our archives as performance artists has suddenly become deeply interesting to collectors and to museums, and we are faced, because it's a different art world, we're faced with a different set of thinkings than perhaps the original thought process that went on as we collected the work. So even though Boyce was out there as a model of somebody who had translated collectible and archival material into art products, most of us on the West Coast, with a very few exceptions, I think Chris Burden was one of them, most of us really didn't think in those terms, and we didn't think about that translation from the archival object into a later, or even at that time, work of art. Performance artists' archives then, including my own, consists of different forms of materiality than prior archives. Of course, they had a lot of writing, production scores, narrative writing, letters, relational communications, and so on. But now you also see the entry of strange artifacts and remnants of performances, and in particular, photographs, new media, including the Portic Pack, and many of our archives, like mine, really look like the development of the history of new technology, from those giant pneumatic videotapes down to more digital forms from today. Now, the other thing that I think is interesting in terms of performance archives, and again, this is still addressing the practical, is we were really thinking a lot about how the work entered the discourse. And early on, that entry was quite simple. It was really the topics, I mean, it was really rumor, it was innuendo, it was kind of the narration of the work. I call Chris Burden's shoot the shot heard round the world. And it was for performance artists. We knew about that work through word-of-mouth communication. That had something to do with the smallness of the world at that point in time. We were a transnational group of people. There weren't a lot of us. You would go to Bologna, you would go to Japan, and so on. And so people traveled around and communicated in a relatively small group of practitioners. And because of that, they, you know, the idea that you could do a work and have it live in the narration of the work, something Capro explored very deeply later on, was quite possible. But today, in this environment, it's a very different situation for how a work of transience enters discourse. So the market for contemporary art today is very different. Most performance artists I know today are thinking simultaneously about the market as they produce the work, and that was pretty much outside of most of our, it was almost a badge of courage not to be thinking about that, but I think the reality was that on the West Coast, we didn't have that kind of access, we didn't have that kind of influence. As I experimented with forms of presentation of the work in galleries and museum settings, my archives were very useful. George talks about actually recreating works, and to some degree I would say that what I was doing was recreating works, but there was still a very strong documentary impulse for me. How do you communicate an ephemeral and transient experience? So unlike some of the performance artists of that time, I very quickly figured out that if you allowed other people to take photographs of your work, and then you allowed them to retain the negatives. And at that time, it wasn't so easy to have, you know, getting the original negative and getting the original slide was pretty critical to staying close to the bone of the most reproducible and the clearest artifact of that work. I remember once Joan Jonas, I was doing one of an exhibition on women's performance art at the Women's Building with Sherry Galke, who's here today as well. And we were sort of thinking about how, I think it was probably the first exhibition of its kind, and we were thinking about how to represent this work. And we contacted Joan and asked her if we could have one of her images, and we had to go through a photographer that retained the rights to her work, and eventually began to sell the rights to her work. And to me, it was very important to hang on to those and the permission. So very quickly, while I have hundreds of artists, including people like Larry Fink, a very well-known, Judith Golden, very well-known photographers, documenting my work, I keep control of the rights to use the work, which allows me to freely enter into publication and other kinds of documentation and representation. I have over, at this point, 60 binders of slides and negatives from that era. Of course, it creates a problem for us trying to move all of that into a digital technology. One of the things, and these are some experiments in a one-woman show I had in Pomona in the 70s. The interesting thing about media technology and performance work is how the increased sophistication of media technology, which goes hand in hand with the performance artist's repertoire, has created an appetite for spectacle. Of course, there's many reasons we have an appetite for spectacle, but one of the things that's a challenge is how do you represent the work that had a certain aura and scale within its time in a contemporary museum setting when the technology is so deeply developed. This is, I show you this because it's interesting to me that I was able at this point in time a few years ago to take a 35mm slide and blow it up into a 6 by 9 foot photograph. But that still becomes, I think, particularly historically when you're thinking about reprising or rethinking artworks, becomes an interesting consideration is what technology is available now and what was then and so on. Another interesting thing that has been referred to in the notes for this conference is how there's a bit of a confusion for artists of my generation about what is the artwork and what is the archive and what is the documentation. I've recently been having conversations with Tate Modern and curators. When I mentioned the word archive, it sort of shifted the relationship to the work, and there was a deep kind of set of conversations going on about what indeed was that work. The other thing I want to point out about that era before I move on to some works is how new media and the much more available photography and experimentation with technology went hand in hand and therefore ended up in archives. I can't tell you how many, I must have 15 boxes of videotapes of various kinds, from Super 8 and High 8 film to 16mm film, and finally to all the different forms of video technology. So like Barbara Smith, who's in the audience and experimented with Xerox, most of us, Paul McCarthy, Ulysses Jenkins, most of us also experimented right away with any kind of recording device, from reel-to-reel audio tape to digital Betacam technology. Everybody pretty much, however, early on photographed their work. So what's interesting is that you'll find these kinds of photographs, documentary, within archives. But they also quickly began to think, particularly as persona developed, they began to think about the choreographed performance, the performance that took place for the lens of the camera or the video. And Eleanor Anton being a very good example of that. These then open up the question, if I have proofs of this in my archives, is that archival work, or is it another form of artist proof of an artwork? And of course, the documentation of an event, even that performed for camera, translated into, in the spirit of video early on, massive distribution. And very quickly we discovered, as I did when MoMA asked about buying one of my videotapes, Learn Where the Meat Comes From, there was this sort of divide. In the beginning, there was this real ample distribution. I mean, the whole idea of cable television and video was to be able to distribute freely and democratically. Some artists, however, got smart, quick, and began to develop limited editions of videotapes, mostly those, not so much on the West Coast, but on the East Coast connected with galleries. And when MoMA approached me, I said, yeah, you can get it quite simply, actually. I think it's around $60 on Video Databank. So there was a divide between artists who began to look at videotapes as the artwork itself and those who used it as a documentation, and then many of us who sort of fell in between. So now I want to talk about two things: archive as art, using the subject matter of art in ways that Sven referred to, and then finally the notion of archive as, or restaging or recreation as revisiting the archive of a performative work. I am interested in archive as a means of exploring relationships and the relationship of memory to relationships within a political context. And while I'm not going to go deeply into any of these works, all of them involve the kind of thinking about what is the role of memory in the reconstruction of relationships of power, of affection, and how does that indeed eventually, as you'll see in my project in Medellin, how does that get translated into political action? So in the Capro retrospective, I was asked to recreate a work. And, well, actually, I don't remember what I was asked, but somehow to be involved with the performance, and I think it was precisely not to recreate a work. I asked Michael Rotundi, who's a Buddhist architect, and Peter Kirby, who's a videographer and a longtime mentee and friend of Capro, as I was, to enter into a conversation that would allow us to create an artwork for Capro's retrospective when it came to MoCA. In thinking about, and the piece was called Trade Talk, and it was loosely structured after, in quotes, Capro's Trading Dirt, which was one of the works of his which exemplified some of the problems Alan had with his relationship to contemporary art discourse. Thinking about his struggles to place his work in the context of this art history in the final years of his life, while contending with his own very influential on me and many other people positions in his work. There was a conflict Capro faced, and I thought that calling attention to this, or perhaps maybe even paying an homage to Alan through what was so important to him about his work, which was ephemerality of experience. So when we would do a Capro piece, we would all sit around afterwards and talk about what we would experience. So there was this sort of initial translation of how we perceive. Now, granted, talking is not experience, but this attempt to communicate what happened in a very nuanced and subtle way to each of us, having nothing to do with you know, having only to do with the situation he set up, but not in any prescriptive way. So I thought about how hard, because I had seen several of his retrospectives in Europe, and I thought about how hard that was to capture that one piece of his work. And there were many experiments in curatorial practice that were trying to do that, including putting out the scores of Alan's pieces and letting other people do them at this time. But I was interested very particularly in how that experience showed up in the museum, not out there as we were doing work. So we brought in a bunch of dirt. There's Michael and Peter looking at a model. This dirt is, and the house metaphor is an allusion to a Zen. Alan talked about trading dirt, which is a piece where he took a bucket of dirt from one place to another and traded it and then just told the story of those trades, starting with a bucket of heavy-duty Buddhist dirt. And so it starts there at the same Zen center where I meditated for years. And we used several other Capro-esque metaphors, the sort of truncated and impossible communication through phones, which kept going down. The circle of chairs and the light bulb, the exposed light bulb, and over there in the corner is a small videotape of Alan recounting trading dirt. But what was important to me about this work is the way it operated to capture experience. So if you were a visitor to the museum, you could go into that phone booth and you could call up and you could leave an experience of a Capro work, whether it was something you'd just done or whether it was through the museum's educational offerings, or whether it was something that you'd done 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And then on each Saturday for several weeks, we convened a conversation. I know Barbara participated in it. There's Peter Frank, Carolee Schneemann, and Nancy Buchanan, Eleanor Anton, David Anton, the Harrisons, people that knew Alan and would talk, but I was very specific. You can't talk about what you know about Alan. You can't talk about good old Alan when he hauled out his lunchbox in the faculty meeting. You got to talk very specifically about what you remember of your experience of his work. So on video and audio, we captured that. We captured those experiences and have created, in essence, through this work, an archive of experience with quotes around experience and knowing the problematics of talking as a representation of experience. We created an archive to Alan and in honor of Alan. Now, next I want to talk about a piece called The Performing Archive with Leslie Labovitz, my colleague from the 70s. We began to, Leslie and I, coincident with the WAC show, began to collate our archives, as people of my generation are wont to do. And we very quickly, after about 6 months, got bored with this activity and decided we would turn it into a performance work, which suddenly became much more interesting. So in this project, we used our archives as actors, essentially, in a variety of settings. And there you see up in the corner is Barbara Smith. This started from a series of conversations that I taped inside our archives with different artists like Alistair MacLennan and Barbara Smith and Martha Wilson, and I explored with them what archive meant. And then we invited young artists who were born during the era that our archive was focusing on, in the 70s essentially. We invited them in to look through these archives, select 10 objects, and tell us what they selected and why, without any help from us. Now, this was based, again, it's a very complex work, but it's based on some issues within feminism about transgenerational communication. It's based on the kind of worth of women's work, on valuations. I think one of you guys mentioned issues of how archives indeed are valued, or that came up with the audience. And so we were really interested in not so much our archives, but how young women were understanding a particular historical period and the difference between their understanding garnered through classes and art books and their understanding as they handled the raw material of what's probably the last generation's completely paper archives. Obviously, from now on, they're going to be much more digital. And so these young women, and the video was intentionally crude, and these young women then were stuck within the boxes of the actual archives, 13 of them, and you could listen to them talk, and it's lovely to listen to their various reflections on this. There's a front piece there where you see these women very slowly going through the material, and then on one side of the room there's a display of archival material. This was shown again. That was the Performing Archive restricted access. This is the Performing Archive open access in Yerba Buena. You see the same kinds of reference. But what was different about this is we invited artists and faculty from around the Bay Area to make appointments for going into the archive boxes with their students and having conversations about them. So this was open access, and this one, I don't have a name for it, but in a sense, with this project at the Haus der Kunst in Berlin, we were exploring the simulation and the artificiality of contemporary practice and how it was very hard for us. Those are empty boxes. And it was very hard for us to deal with. You know, the curator was quite blithe. She said, let's just reconstruct a bunch of empty boxes. And I said, you know, it's just really hard for me to do that coming from my era. So now I want to quickly go to restaging performances as obviously as a form of archival practice. For me as an artist, I will never restage a piece unless there's two intrinsic unknowns. One is that it works within a different political context and sets before me a set of political questions that are contemporary and appropriate for this time. And the other is that it's got to be aesthetically interesting. Why would I want to recreate an artwork when to me, it makes no sense. It's just not the kind of schools of thought that I have been educated in. So this piece, I'm going to actually flip through. It's called Stories of Work and Survival, and it's about inside museums and outside museums and so on. But I want to talk more importantly, I think, about this work, and that work was at MoCA around 2007, coincident with the WAC show. I want to talk about this work in 99 to 2000 in Medellin, Colombia. I was fortunate to enter Colombia at a time when, over a 10-year period, there was a conscious effort to reconstruct society and within a still war-torn culture, and to create a civil society. And I was fortunate to work with Pilar Riaño Alcala, the anthropologist who actually brought me there, and a set of NGOs and human rights activists and people in Barrio Antioquia. And what we did was operate within this highly territorialized barrio within the middle of Medellin to create a moving bus consisting of 500 objects that have to do with memories of people. This is built on Pilar Riaño's work on the relationship between memory, the recuperation of memory in cultural and group settings, and violence abatement. So it's way too complex to get involved with at this point. But basically this work then began 10 years later, or over the next, or this bus moves out. Young people that were part of the original collection of the object move around with the bus, and it has audio tape and these 500 objects, each of which carry their own personal meanings and yet collectively cultural meanings. And Pilar's work is also looking at the material, about how material objects carry meaning. Of course, one of the most meaningful parts of the bus was this shelf where many of the young people who had been killed in 10 recent years in the barrio were, and this is one of the young people from Barrio Antioquia who was killed during the construction of the work. And these are some of the people we worked with. Now 10 years, so that bus in itself obviously is an archive. But what I really want to point to today is now we're 11 years later, and Pilar and I were invited back to the Medellin Biennale. And we were asked to rethink or represent or recreate this work. And so we thought a lot about whether that community still existed. It's 11 years later, and indeed it did. We were able to get in contact with people, but more important, this work set in the midst of an ongoing conversation about violence and about the work of memory, and at this point, Medellin has a museum of memory, which it didn't have in 2000, in 2000. So a lot had changed during that 10 years, and we wanted to reconvene the people that we had worked with, some portion of them, and look at the materiality of the relationships, the kind of experience of community that we had had in being there. So in the Museo de Antioquia, we created a remnant shelf, a kind of an iconic remnant from the bus with some of the same artifacts and other kinds of layered translations, letters, and so on. And at one end of the room is the main function of this exhibition was these two videos in dialogue with each other. And at one end was the documentation of the work from 1999-2000. And the other was 16 people that we had worked with, thinking not sort of simplistic and sentimentally about, oh, I remember when and that work, but looking at the intervening 11 years and the shifts in culture and their own lives and the issue of violence, how it had transformed and indeed not transformed. So this piece is sort of the memory of memory, the memory of skin of memory. And of course there was archival material as well that explained the social context and the broader context of the work. And then we reconvened. This is over 50 people who came now instead of to the barrio and to the various places we had met before, but to the center of the museum, and reconnected with each other by, again, talking about the role of violence and the reconstruction of a social fabric in a war-torn country. Finally, I just want to say that I am in the process of recreating 3 weeks in May for the Pacific Standard Time show. And I won't go into that now, save to say that I thought long and hard before agreeing to do this. The context for violence against women is extremely different than the context in '77. This piece came into existence for 2 reasons. One, as a notion of expanded performance, broadening the audience of the art and engaging real-life issues, and 2, making visible a rather invisible subject. And so what we did at that time was this map, 2 maps actually, at the center of the city, and a series of everyday, daily marks from police reports. So I'd go to the police department, get a report, and go back and put it on the map at the location of the map, and performances and speak outs. I'm sure Sherry Galkey's someplace in that. In fact, crowd of women kicking their legs in a self-defense demonstration. Today, I'm going to retain that original artwork and that original embodied act of going daily to the police department, but this time I'll be receiving, as the police told me, I'll be receiving at 0600 the reports from the previous day through their Blackberries. And probably more importantly, I'll be creating a kind of a mirror to the original map with social media and websites and so on. So there'll be sort of 2 conversations taking place, one in real time and spread throughout LA, and one in media technology time. Thank you.
Okay, do you hear me? Is this okay? Well, my name is there. I'm Mario Garcia Torres. I'm an artist, and I first want to say thanks to inviting me here, because it's been kind of an interesting process to think about my work in relation to the archive. I have been working for some years, and I'm really interested in sort of rethinking my relationship to history, and specifically to a recent history for the last 30 or 40 years, and how the work that I'm interested in and the practices that I'm interested in that have happened throughout the last 30, 40 years, how I can relate to that. More specifically, because coming from Mexico, I had a sort of a hard time sort of trying to think how I can relate myself to those kind of practices. So that sort of at some point led to the work to start becoming some kind of historical research. And in sometimes I end up having some kind of relationship to archives, but more intrinsically to history, and about sort of thinking about what is not in the archives, and what could I draw in a more humane way out of those histories that I'm interested in. I think that my work at the end could be seen as some kind of archive. Of course, I'm somebody who I'm way more conscious about the way archives and documentation works, probably in relation to the people who were working 30 or 40 years ago. And so in a way, I think that the practice of the archive has become almost part of my practice itself. When at some point it was just documentation of something, now I feel like most of my works are the actual archive. I also started, I wanted to bring up one or two works that have to do with letters, and how that letters, or how that form of communication that is very prominent in archives actually have allowed me to figure out the way to share something in a very personal way. I think that I'm really interested in sort of communicating my interest in history, but at the same time I'm really opposed to the fact of trying to say that this is history, that of sort of being too proud about my findings in relation to that. And I'm more interested in saying, like, look, this is what I found, and this is my experience in this specific interest, and how I got there. So most of my works are about, they end up being some kind of very personal, in some way intimate communication about my experience with history and my experience with specific, less known, most of the time less known peripherical histories in the last in relation to contemporary art or recent history. So I'm gonna start by showing this piece, which I started making a long time ago, and it kind of probably illustrate a little bit that, like, it illustrate my consciousness about the fact that my daily life as an artist becomes an archive, and also it illustrates that sort of low profile kind of communication. This is a work called "I Promise to Make My Best as an Artist," and it's something that I started to do in 2004, and in a sort of very personal way, I sort of sit down one day. I was traveling to Las Vegas to see Michael Heiser's piece, and I was in some strange way. I don't have the reasoning why, but I sort of sit down and wrote this line in a piece of paper at the hotel where I was staying at, and then after some time I realized that if I will keep doing this, it will become some kind of documentation of my practice, of how my work was being received or not received. So at the end, this is now a work that is compromised. I mean, it's composed of I can remember like 40 or 40 something pages like this, and it's something that I do every time that I am traveling, and I sort of stop when I'm traveling and I'm doing something related to art, and if the hotel has a piece of paper from the hotel, then I write think about it and think how much more I want to make my best as an artist, and I do the writing. So after a while it becomes this kind of documentation of how much activity I have or not. And this is another work that I wanted to show in relation to that, because I think when I did this piece, I really realized the potential of that sort of letters and of personal communication in a way. This is a piece where I write a letter to a Mexican painter called Dr. Atl, and it's a work that had a very, very immediate interest, or in a way it sort of pretended to denunciate something that I wasn't in agreement with, but in a way I was trying to sort of figure out the way to communicate that disagreement, and at the same time thinking about my own history and my own relationship to, or what had happened in Mexico, what had happened in the history of Mexico, and what did that have to do with the idea of putting a museum, a Guggenheim museum in Mexico specifically. I'm going to show that piece. It's a 5-minute, 6-minute video, and so it's a small mute video. So you will read the letter that I wrote, and it's quite, it sort of explains itself a lot. sort of, and I think this piece exemplify very much the way I've been trying to work. I've been trying to sort of combine those histories that I'm interested in and trying to figure out what are the sort of political implications that they have and how I can relate to that. I've been interested in sort of discovering history and sort of discovering history in a different way, and for that sometimes I end up going to archives and things like that. But I'm also interested in figuring out a way to tell a different story and to figure out what is actually not in the history and what is not in the archives. This one piece, it's quite unique, but I wanted to show it to you because it's something that I did, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and it comes out of a story that I saw published in Art News from '69, and I was sort of browsing through magazines without really a specific interest in it, and then I figured out there was the description or the review of an artist that I've never heard of, which was Oscar Neustern. And I started reading it, and it seemed really, really interesting, the fact that that I've never heard of the artist, and nevertheless it described very much a lot of things that were happening just now, the type of work that were being distributed and exhibited right now. And I never figured out who wrote the piece of review, but of course immediately it became clear that this was a fictional artist, that somebody had allowed this text to be published, but nevertheless was very, very interesting. It described an artist who was interested in the absolute and the void, and it was somebody who had no memory whatsoever, so his work became this constant search for something which could never have an end, because his memory was being erased at the same time that he was doing things. And so at the end I decided to sort of recreate the only work that was apparently ever shown, which was just a press release and an invitation of an exhibition back in '69. And this is something that I wanted to show you. I'm gonna show you hopefully three works that somehow relate to that same approach to history. This is the work of Rafael Ferrer, an artist from Puerto Rico that I was very interested in, and which led to the development of a larger story, which had to do with an exhibition that Robert Morris curated in '69 in New York called 9 at Leo Castelli. This work of Rafael Ferrer, he's an artist that is not so known, but he was doing, at the time of the late '60s and early '70s, was doing very, very interesting work. And I started to look at these things, and he ended up doing this piece, which consisted only in dropping leaves in the stair of an exhibition, specifically the exhibition that Robert Morris curated. And started digging in and figure out that there was a lot of interesting things about this show. The fact that first it was it's an exhibition that a lot of people know, but the details around it were not so clear. So I sort of started getting into it and trying to ask questions around, more than going to archives, was sort of trying to talk to people and figure out who had been there and what had happened. This is some of the photographs that were actually officially taken by the gallery. These photographs now are in the American Art Archives, and I was recently I could manage to get them. And this is a show that happened. Just to get the fact, this is a show that happened uptown in New York, in 108th Street, in a place that was called the Leo Castelli Warehouse. And it's a place that they used for as a storage, and eventually they started using it to make shows, and it had a program for around a year. And at some point they asked Robert Morris to create something, or I don't know if he came up with the idea or not. This is also the place where the Alter Daily project happened. And this happened a few months before, and it sort of pretended to illustrate his anti-form thesis that he had published in our forum. So he invited a number of artists to make works. Some of them became very even iconic works, like the Richard Serapis that is in the back and the Splash Serapis that is in the back. And the other work that sort of brought me to the show as well was the Stephen Kaltenbach piece, which is the felt piece that is down somewhere in the middle of the room. And this is another photograph of the piece, and there's of the show, which has a sculpture by Bill Bollinger in the back, and Alan Sarret in the front, and then there's a piece by Naumann, this plaque of aluminium. And this is an interesting photograph for me because this also kept me going researching for the show, because I figured out that some of the details were never clear, and the reason why the list of names and the list of works were never clear is probably because some of the works didn't arrive on time. Probably this one work by Anselmo, this lead piece, it probably arrived late and it was never reviewed. Nevertheless, it ended up being in some of the photographs. And this is another photograph of the same place. As you can see, they remove the works and they rearrange them. And I was very, very interested in the fact that thinking about an exhibition of Morris being some kind of almost like a theater piece where things were moving in this platform of the exhibition. These are some of the iconic photographs of the show. This is back of when the moment of the Anselmo piece was there. And then not long ago I had a show in Vancouver, and I was asking people around there, again, I think I just go places and sort of ask people what they know about things that I'm interested in. And I had a very, very nice surprise to know that Ian Wallace, the artist from Vancouver, actually had been in this show. And I was really, really happy to see that finally there was a color photograph of the exhibition, which was a great surprise for me. As you can see, this is just a close-up of that one corner of the exhibition. So I sort of ended up, I've been sort of researching this thing for some time, and I just ask people and keep looking at things. And so very recently I decided to show all these photographs, and I will show you how. This was also a very, very interesting discovery, because for some time I had been talking to Stephen Kaltenbach, and he always thought that his felt piece was gray, and because it was always been in black and white photographs. But then when I found this, I had to email him and say, like, do you know that your piece was actually red? And the other myth about it was that it was the wife of Lichtenstein, the painter, who was taking care of the show. And Kaltenbach piece was meant to be rearranged every day, which he believed was never actually, that actually had never happened. But this photograph also tells that they were actually rearranged, if not daily, it was rearranged throughout the show. This is a Bruce Nauman piece. And this is a Richard Serra piece. And this is the recreation of a show which I did in 2009. At some point I wanted to, before finding these color photographs, I was really, really interested in figuring out how to experience those works in a different way. So I went about actually physically making them, which was a really, really fantastic experience, because I almost never do anything with my hands. And it was really, really interesting to think about those materials and think about the experience of having that show. And throughout these years, I made first this exhibition. All this became trash afterwards, but I sort of kept trying to experience that again and again. So I actually have remade these pieces a few times in very different locations. This is again the Rafael Ferrer made not long ago in my studio. I just felt like I needed to have something interested in the stair of my studio, and I throw these leaves and they stayed there for a month or so, and then I took them out and threw them away. And these are some more photograph of the installation of the Richard Serra, which was quite tricky. And this is this is me trying to make the Anselmo piece. The very beginning of this approach was to, which is something that also has to happen several times in my work, is that when there's nothing that I could sort of grab or figure out the way how to tell a story and how to understand something, a lot of time a gesture that I do is to trying to go back and look for places. At some point, I was asked to make a book, so I made a book about the show. But the only photographs that were there are the photographs of the location where the show happened, 30 years after. So this is the photographs of the place. Sort of, I went back to the place, which is now a parking lot, and it had been a parking lot before the Leo Castelli show. And it's been several things, and now it's back being a parking lot. So I just went in there and tried to take the installation photographs again, but this time without the works. And this is the way I recently show what I had found. This is the photograph. On the right is the photographs that I took, and then the next to it, projected, is the Ian Wallace photographs. And then in the boxes, the original Harry Shunk photographs. And then I had some frames with reproductions of the things that I had remade and the remaking of the show. This is another work that I wanted to show you. This is a work that it's been shown a lot. Had to do with the sort of research that I made around a work by Robert Barry, that happened in David Askewald's project class in Nova Scotia. At the time when I started doing the research of this, I was doing works that had to do with expiration and to the works that had an end before they were actually made. So I discovered that Robert Barry had made something very similar, and I started to ask questions and say until what degree that work was actually expired or not. So I sort of went into a research and started trying to talk to people. The work of Robert Barry had to do with the secret piece that was submitted to the project class, and the project class had to do with getting together and doing works by other people. Anyway, I'm gonna go fast through it because the work actually explains my research. So, and the important thing that I wanted to show to you is that normally the work is that slide show that is on the top of the photograph, but not long ago I showed this in Taipei, and I didn't want to show the piece by itself, but I show also works of the students that were involved in this project. This is some of the works, but so I'm just going to go through it. And yeah, that's the end of it. Do I still have time now? Anyway, I think this is, it was important to show it because not only was interesting for me to explain how I've been sort of trying to rescue those stories that are not necessarily written or going to sources that are not really the most common ones, but also in relation to, I think it was very interesting to talk to David Askewell, for example, on why he decided to balk and to tape the conversation. And there was this idea in the 60s or late 60s where documentation was a very very important thing to do, and so he did that even though knowing that the artist didn't want that to happen. And so there was all these conversations of how when things become a documentation or not, and in what regard that tape, if it ever existed or if it was ever listened to, was that the work or not? Was that the documentation of the work, or what was that? Which is part of the questions that I was trying to ask when I did this piece, and sort of trying to figure out how to ask these conversations without actually asking the question of what that secret was. So in that sense, in terms of this symposium, I thought it was an interesting story. And I don't know, maybe I will just describe this piece, which is, it's a photograph of something that I got this morning actually, and it's, they invite me to do, I was, some years ago I started to be interested in the work of Christopher de Arcangelo. I don't know how many of you know about his work, but he was a really, really interesting artist that was actually in LA for some time in the 70s. And he commits suicide at some point in his life, so his work is, the number of works is limited. And he did a very, anyway, I started to be interested in his work some years ago, and I wrote a text about it, and sort of in the idea of trying to let people know about his work. And not long ago, I got this invitation to do something about that research, and to do something about the fact that I had been in the Fales Library in New York, sort of trying to look at the archives there of his work, which were donated like a year ago or so. And they invite me specifically to collaborate it with something that will end up being added to the archive at the Fales Library. So his work was so tight and complicated that I figured I cannot really tell much about it. But the only thing that I could figure out was to sort of add information to what he had done. And I was very specifically interested in a work that he had done when around 78, where he went to the Louvre Museum and unhanged a painting. And there's some photographs about this action, but there's not much information about it. So the only thing I could do was to go back to the Louvre, look at the painting that he had unhanged, and try to investigate and sort of know a little bit more about the painting. So this is the way the work end up being presented, and it's the objects that will end up being inside the archive. So I'm really, I mean, in that sense, I wanted to show it to you because it's interesting for me to figure out the way to intervene the archives and sort of keep relativizing. Is that the word? Relativizing the way archives sort of tell the story or something. Thank you.